Hi guys, welcome back. We are doing Unit 3, Discussion 3, Natural Selection and Speciation today. So we're going to cover natural selection, what is a species, and then patterns of evolution. Natural selection is defined as the process through which organisms evolve in response to environmental pressures. And in order for this to happen, there are three principles or conditions that must be true in order for this to occur. So, number one, the characteristics of organisms are inherited or passed from parent to offspring. What that means is that parents have to be able to give their traits to their children. If they can't, then this natural selection can occur because then the traits aren't being passed down in a meaningful way. Number two, more offspring are produced than are able to survive. In other words, resources for survival and reproduction are limited. Thus, there is competition for those resources in each generation. So, if you are in an environment where it can support the whole population without there being competition, then there's not going to be any pressure for who can better survive in the environment, right? And that's what natural selection really is. It's which organisms better survive and then give those survival traits to their children. So if there's no competition, there is no natural selection. And then number three, offspring have to vary among each other in regard to their characteristics and the variations that are inherited. If everybody is an identical clone, then it doesn't matter if those traits are inherited, you're not going to have any difference in survival chances, right? You have to have some traits that are better or worse, or natural selection isn't going to occur. So, again, our three principles: traits must be inherited, there must be competition, and there must be variation. So, an adaptation is what we call that trait that's inherited that aids in the survival and reproduction of an organism in its present environment. An adaptation isn't something that occurs in an organism's lifetime per se. A lot of times when we think about it colloquially, we'll say, oh, you can adapt to the environment or you can adapt to this new situation. But when we talk about adaptation in the context of natural selection and in the context of evolution, we're talking about a trait that's inherited. So it's not something that they're going to gain per se within their lifetime. And then the other one that's really important to know when we talk about adaptations is fitness. And fitness here is a measure of how well your adaptations match your environment. Now, this is not a measure of how physically strong necessarily. It's not a measure of how fast an organism can run. It's literally a measure of how well you match your environment. And we measure this by reproductive success. So, how many offspring did you create? Even if maybe, let's say, we've got oxen and one is super strong and can pull more than anybody else, but they only had one offspring survive, then that's not going to be very fit, right? Another thing to note here is that an adaptation that might have been good for your grandfather or your great grandfather might not be good for you. A common one that we talk about are the moths in Great Britain. Prior to industrialization, light colored moths were more successful for their environment because they matched the light colored trees that were native to their land. After industrialization, the soot and the smog and everything darkened the tree color on their bark. And so the darker colored moss became more prevalent because they were more suited to that environment now. Interestingly enough, after things like the EPA and environmental regulations, the lighter color moss have returned as trees have returned to their lighter colors. So those adaptations may fluctuate, um, and there may be change in what's better and what's not as it goes. So, what is a species? A species, by definition, is a basic unit of classification for organisms. One of the more traditional ways of defining a species or grouping them is by this first set of information you see here. So, a group of organisms that are capable of interbreeding and producing fertile offspring. So, note that this definition obviously doesn't work for organisms that reproduce asexually. Um, and also, it's not necessarily a great definition. And we're going to talk about another one that we'll use because species that are very closely related, like types of big cats and everything, can reproduce and sometimes create fertile offspring. So, based on this rule, though, one species is distinguished from another by the possibility of matings between individuals from each species to produce those fertile offspring. Obviously, a cow can't reproduce with a bear, right? And of course, that's one's a simple one and easy, and they're very drastically different. But when we start looking at the exceptions to rule, if we have shared ancestors that are closely related, you get things like mules and ligers, and a lot of them are infertile, but some are not. And that's how you get new species of domestic cats or things like that. So this one is a very traditional definition, but if we really want to talk about how you break things down and look at it from an evolutionary perspective, we've actually moved more to defining it based on phylogeny. So, phylogeny is our evolutionary history of species. And what we look at when we group it by phylogeny is we look at shared derived characteristics. So, the phylogenetic species concept is this is where species are defined as the smallest group of populations that can be identified by a unique set of characteristics. And this one's really more accurate and more updated to match the information that we currently have. So, speciation then is the formation of two species from one. And this occurs through often reproductive isolation, whether geographical or behavioral. Geographical would be maybe they get split, one crosses a mountain range and the other does not. Sometimes you can get even as simple as a highway being put in, divides a population, and now they're isolated. Behavioral changes vary. So sometimes you can get, like with fish, some will live closer to the surface while others will live closer to the bottom of a pond or a lake. And they can actually grow far enough apart that it starts affecting their mating seasons and things like that. So if their mating seasons shift and maybe the fish toward the top, mate earlier in the spring or later, or maybe they stop swimming deeper so they don't cross, then you can get those behavioral changes and that isolation as well. So, one kind of quirky type of speciation that we're going to talk about is called adaptive radiance. Typically, when you have a new species, you have one species breaking into two. Like one will split off and they'll diverge. But occasionally, you will actually get one species that turns into many. Examples of this are Darwin's finches or the Lake Malawi's chicklets. And this is called adaptive radiance. It's called radiance because when we see it pictured, you'll often see the original species in a center and then all of the others shooting out around it like a sunburst. This typically happens when you have an initial population that experiences geographical isolation. Um, Again, with Darwin's finches, they each ended up on different islands and then developed different sets of traits based on what survived best on the island. And then again, this happens over a long period of time. So that is adaptive radiance. Remember, what makes this unique is one base species turns into many in a single step of speciation, as opposed to creating many but diverging one at a time in this long kind of ladder going down. So, last but not least, we're going to talk about patterns of evolution. So, patterns of evolution is going to describe ways that we see things evolve. Our first one is called divergent evolution, and this is what most people think of when you think of evolution. You have a common ancestor and then two species will come out of that one, they'll break off and then evolve in different directions. So a common ancestor of the cat, and then they break off to have all the different forms of cats that you know today. This leads to homologous structures. So remember, these are structures that have similar functions and structure because they came from the same ancestor, even after the species diverged. If we were to think of a phylogenetic tree, divergent evolution is just that one line and then one branch off. So next is convergent evolution. This is, you can almost think of it as the opposite. So divergent, to diverge is to go separate directions. Converge means to come together. So species will evolve similar traits and structures, but not having shared ancestors. So this leads to analogous structures, which are structures that have those similar functions, but evolved independently. That doesn't mean necessarily that these species, when we talk about convergent evolution, they are not crossing paths on the evolutionary tree. So a bee and a bat did not mix at some point just because they both have wings, right? So don't get that confused. Don't make that mistake with it. It just means they've developed similar traits and kind of come to that point of having wings or come to the point of having antennae without sharing an ancestor. Parallel evolution is where we have closely related species in separate but similar environments, and they'll independently involve similar features. So this is a type of convergent evolution for closely related species. The trick here to helping remember this is taking a similar species, but remembering that they don't have the shared ancestor with the trait that we're talking about. So when we talk about parallel evolution, we're looking at the features or the traits specifically. So maybe, let's say zebras and antelope evolved their stripes separately. They're very closely related on that evolutionary tree, right? But if they didn't have an ancestor that had striped fur patterns, then those would be a parallel evolution where they both evolved it on their own, but kind of coming from the same starting point. And then last but not least, coevolution. When we talk about coevolution, we're talking about evolution in two species that are unrelated, but happen as a result of selective pressures that they impose on each other. So we talked about the coevolution of the Earth's atmosphere. Well, this happens in species too. We see it a lot with flowers and their pollinators. You can see it with fish and some of the plants that they're part of as well. You get a little bit of a sad story here, though, because sometimes plants will lose their pollinators and then they die off because they had so carefully crafted themselves to be, the perfect buddy in this buddy system for these plants and pollinators that nothing else can pollinate them. Ginkgo trees have this issue, Joshua trees. There are so many more that we see these co-evolved relationships that developed between plants and other organisms, and then it starts to fall apart when one of them goes extinct. And that is where we'll be stopping. Next time, we'll be talking about extinction and continental drift.